The final phase of the Pacific War saw a drastic shift in American strategy against the entrenched Japanese Empire. This shift moved beyond conventional fleet engagements and massive island invasions to a more insidious form of warfare. The relentless bomber offensive against Japanese cities became the public face of the end game. Yet, a quieter, more devastating campaign was unfolding in the very waters that defined Japan's economic existence. This secret weapon was the naval mine, deployed from the air with unprecedented scale and precision by the U.S. Army Air Force's B-29 Superfortress fleet. Operation Starvation was the deceptively benign name given to this strategic mining initiative designed to cripple Japan's maritime supply lines. The nation of Japan, an archipelago utterly reliant on sea commerce for raw materials, fuel, and food, was essentially being turned into a vast, UN-victualled island fortress. Before this operation, naval mining had traditionally been the domain of surface ships and submarines, a slow, methodical process easily countered by an alert enemy. The innovation here lay in the delivery method, utilizing the long-range capabilities of the B-29 to scatter thousands of mines directly into critical coastal choke points. These mines were not just simple contact weapons, they were technologically advanced instruments of disruption, armed with magnetic, acoustic, and pressure sensors. This technological superiority meant the mines could not be reliably swept by the Japanese Navy's rudimentary countermeasure tactics. The primary target was not the Imperial Japanese Navy's dwindling battle fleet but the vital coastal shipping that kept the home island's industries alive. By cutting off the flow of resources like coal, iron ore, and especially oil from occupied territories, the American High Command sought to induce a total economic collapse. This strategy was less about sinking warships and more about starving the industrial and military complex into submission. The initial response from the Imperial Japanese Navy was a mixture of disbelief and outright derision regarding the perceived effectiveness of airdropped mines. They had vastly underestimated the dedication of the American effort and the sophistication of the deployed ordnance. This early, fatal misjudgment would soon cost them their remaining commercial lifelines and contribute significantly to their ultimate defeat. The waters of the Japanese home islands were quietly transformed into a vast, lethal minefield, a network of submerged traps waiting for the next passing hull. The first salvos of airdropped mines were met with a curious mixture of Japanese complacency and strategic overconfidence in their own coastal defenses. Imperial Japanese Navy IJN intelligence initially believed the American efforts were a nuisance, a minor psychological operation rather than a concerted, existential threat. Their disdain stemmed partly from the early, unreliable performance of their own naval mines and partly from a deeply ingrained belief in the supremacy of fleet-on-fleet combat. They viewed the mine as a weapon of attrition, suitable only for auxiliary roles, and certainly not capable of deciding the fate of a nation. This mocking attitude was bolstered by the initial low density of the American mine-laying runs over vast coastal areas. Early in 1945, the sight of a B-29 laying mines, rather than high explosives, might have elicited a sense of relief from air defense crews. This relief proved to be deeply misplaced, as the American strategy focused on quality of placement rather than sheer quantity of ordnance. The most critical factor in the IJN's dismissal was their severe underestimation of the speed and scale at which the Americans could replenish and expand these minefields. Their limited minesweeping fleet was already overstretched, poorly equipped, and largely unprepared to deal with a mass-produced, non-contact mine threat. The IJN's resources were overwhelmingly dedicated to rebuilding their aircraft carrier force and defending against conventional bomber raids. The relatively invisible nature of the mining campaign allowed it to escalate dramatically without triggering a proportionate defensive response. Japanese naval reports often downplayed the early shipping losses, attributing them to submarines or navigational errors, failing to see the pattern emerging in the Straits. Senior IJN officers considered the American use of B-29s, massive strategic bombers, to deploy mines as an extravagant and inefficient use of valuable resources. They simply did not grasp the American shift from tactical warfare to purely economic strangulation using this relatively new method of delivery. The lack of effective acoustic and magnetic sweepers meant that Japanese counter-operations were often futile, merely clearing a narrow, temporary path through a dense field. This false sense of security, built on a technological and strategic blind spot, allowed the minefields to mature and become truly lethal without major interference. The consequence of this dismissal was that essential sea lanes remained open in name but closed in practical, safe reality, setting the stage for disaster. In the quiet darkness of the early months of 1945, Operation Starvation moved from a theoretical concept to a terrifying reality for the Japanese Empire. The B-29 formations, typically associated with the devastating firebombing of Tokyo and Nagoya, were repurposed for this silent, invisible war at sea. Starting in earnest in March 1945, the superfortresses began their methodical, relentless nightly runs over Japan's most vital waterways. The target set was meticulously chosen, focusing not on the open sea but on the narrow, constrained straits and harbor entrances that Japanese shipping was forced to use. These geographic choke points, such as the Shimonoseki Strait, became the primary killing grounds, engineered for maximum disruption. The strategy was simple: place a fence of mines across the only viable routes, effectively bottling up internal and external commerce. Each BA-29 was capable of carrying and precisely deploying dozens of mines on a single sortie, far exceeding the capacity of traditional mine layers. The air delivery system provided a level of stealth and speed that minesweepers simply could not counter or predict. The mines themselves were dropped in varying patterns and with staggered activation times, making sweeping a random and extremely dangerous proposition. For the bomber crews, flying the B-29s at relatively low altitudes to ensure precision mine placement was itself a perilous mission. Yet, the strategic payoff was immediate and devastating, as initial shipping losses began to skyrocket with inexplicable rapidity. The first few weeks alone saw a measurable drop in coastal traffic, as captains and shipping companies grew wary of the mysterious sinkings. The American objective was never total destruction, but rather to induce the kind of uncertainty and fear that would halt shipping activity entirely. A single minefield could effectively block a major port for days, even weeks, while the Japanese struggled with futile and dangerous clearance attempts. The deployment of magnetic, acoustic, and pressure mines required Japanese vessels to use specialized, time-consuming countermeasures, none of which were reliable. The pressure mines, in particular, were insidious, designed to wait for a specific hull size and signature, often allowing smaller, less important vessels to pass harmlessly. This selective nature added to the confusion and unpredictability, making it impossible for the IJN to determine a consistent, safe path. Operation Starvation was not a spectacular military victory, but it was a demonstration of overwhelming industrial capacity married to cutting-edge strategic thinking. The groundwork laid by the B-29 crews silently guaranteed the economic isolation and eventual surrender of the Japanese nation. The Shimonoseki Strait, connecting the Sea of Japan with the Inland Sea, became the quintessential example of the mining campaign's effectiveness. This narrow passage between Honshu and Kyushu was the single most vital artery for internal Japanese shipping, particularly for the transport of coal and raw materials. It was an unavoidable bottleneck through which nearly all of Japan's domestic maritime trade was forced to pass. The strait's constrained geography, with its shallow depths and strong currents, made it an ideal location for the American mine deployment. The B-29 systematically and methodically seeded the strait with thousands of mines over a period of several months. The density of the minefields reached a point where passage became a near-suicidal gamble for any captain. The Japanese Navy's attempt to maintain a clear channel was an act of constant, desperate, and often unsuccessful warfare against an unseen enemy. The losses in the strait quickly mounted, moving from isolated incidents to a catastrophic hemorrhage of cargo vessels and auxiliary ships. The economic impact of the Shimonoseki closure alone was immediate and crippling to the already strained Japanese war economy. Shipments of Manchurian coal, essential for Japanese industry and power generation, were completely halted, leading to massive production cutbacks. The disruption was so severe that some historians credit the mining of the strait with a greater overall economic effect than the more visible firebombing campaigns. The limited number of successful trips through the strait became increasingly risky, often undertaken only by small, fast, and poorly protected vessels. The IJN was forced to divert significant resources, including precious oil and manpower, into futile minesweeping operations. These operations often led to the loss of the minesweepers themselves, further diminishing Japan's capacity to keep any port open. The American strategy was perfectly executed, targeting the single point of failure in Japan's logistical network and exploiting its vulnerability. The IJN, unable to either reliably clear the mines or find viable alternative routes, watched its vital commerce collapse within this narrow stretch of water. The strait, once a bustling corridor of trade, was transformed into a watery grave and a silent testament to the efficacy of the new airdropped naval mine. The inability to safely traverse the strait effectively divided the Japanese home islands, crippling internal resource distribution and starving the key industrial centers. The success of the American mining campaign lay directly in the technological sophistication of the Mark series of naval mines. These were not the cumbersome, primitive contact mines of previous wars, but intelligent, non-contact weapons designed to exploit a ship's inherent signatures. The magnetic mine detected the change in the Earth's magnetic field caused by the passing steel hull of a vessel. It waited for this signature, exploding directly beneath the keel of the ship, creating a catastrophic structural failure. The acoustic mine was armed to respond to the distinct noise and vibrations created by a ship's propellers and engines. Each Japanese class of ship had a unique acoustic signature, and the mines could be calibrated to target only larger, more valuable vessels. This gave the American planners the ability to selectively sink military targets or essential cargo ships while theoretically sparing smaller fishing vessels. The pressure mine was perhaps the most insidious, designed to sense the slight but measurable decrease in water pressure caused by a ship moving overhead. Pressure mines were virtually impossible to sweep, as the conventional method of dragging a wire or using magnetic influence would not trigger them. The IJN's primitive countermeasures were simply not equipped to deal with this multi-sensor threat array. They had been built to deal with contact mines or simple magnetic mines, not the layered complexity of the American ordnance. A typical Japanese minesweeping operation would involve dragging a cable to snag a contact mine or creating a powerful magnetic field to trigger a simple magnetic mine. These methods proved useless against the sophisticated American mines, which often contained multiple activation mechanisms that had to be triggered simultaneously. The time delay fuses and ship counting features of the mines further complicated the Japanese clearance efforts. A mine could be programmed to ignore the first 5 or 10 passing vessels, waiting for a high-value target to make the eventual sacrifice of a minesweeper utterly pointless. This element of delay and uncertainty broke the morale of the Japanese crews and made every trip a terrifying calculation of risk. The technological superiority of the American mines ensured that for every one mine cleared, several more remained, silently watching and waiting in the depths. This combination of sensors turned the seemingly clear waters of the Straits into an invisible, technologically advanced killing zone. The initial mocking tone of the Imperial Japanese Navy quickly dissolved as the terrifying reality of the mining campaign became undeniable. The goal of Operation Starvation was realized not just through the total number of ships sunk, but through the paralyzing fear it instilled in Japanese commerce. As the losses mounted in the major straits and harbors, shipping insurance rates became non-existent, and captains refused to sail. The Japanese merchant marine, already decimated by submarine warfare and bombing, entered a state of near-total operational paralysis. The movement of essential bulk goods, particularly the coal needed to fuel the home island's remaining industry, ceased almost entirely. Industrial output plummeted in the months leading up to the end of the war, a direct result of the choked sea lanes and lack of raw materials. The impact was felt throughout the entire economy, leading to factory closures, power shortages, and rapidly diminishing reserves of food and fuel. The coastal railway network, which was meant to be the secondary distribution system, was hopelessly inadequate to pick up the slack. The sheer volume of goods that historically moved by sea could not be absorbed by the dilapidated and bombed-out rail infrastructure. Every successful mine run by AB-29 saved American troops from having to secure an entire island or fight a costly, bloody siege. The mines were a weapon of economic warfare that achieved the equivalent of a successful conventional blockade without the risk to surface ships. The Japanese government, desperate to maintain some semblance of resource flow, resorted to using smaller, less efficient wooden vessels. These minor ships were supposed to be safer, yet the magnetic and pressure mines were still a deadly threat to their steel components or large displacement. The cumulative effect was a self-fulfilling prophecy of national collapse, with the lack of materials creating a downward spiral in morale and production. The waters surrounding Japan, their historical source of strength and trade, had become a prison wall constructed of invisible, submerged explosives. The sight of disabled, listing vessels in formerly bustling harbors became a common, grim reminder of the war's relentless toll. This silent, ongoing economic catastrophe contributed significantly to the argument for surrender among Japan's political and military leadership. The Japanese response to the mounting mining crisis was often characterized by a dangerous and futile adherence to outdated procedures. They attempted to establish tightly controlled, supposedly safe channels, which created an illusion of security that was quickly shattered. These channels were typically swept by a handful of minesweepers, a process that was slow, noisy, and highly visible to American intelligence. The B-29 crews, flying high above the sweeping activity, would simply reseed the cleared areas moments after the Japanese vessels departed. This constant reseeding turned the Japanese counter-operations into an exhausting and ultimately pointless exercise in repetition. The sheer number of mines deployed meant that even a marginally effective sweep would leave behind a sufficient density to deter or disable shipping. Japanese captains were often ordered to follow the minesweepers in single file, an incredibly risky maneuver that concentrated their remaining valuable vessels. The American pressure mines, designed to ignore the initial sweepers, would then detonate under the heavy keel of the following cargo ship. This particular trick was a psychological masterstroke, reinforcing the feeling that the seas themselves were actively hostile and unpredictable. The IJN's failure to recognize the pressure mine's unique signature meant they were unknowingly leading their own vessels into carefully planned traps. The captains who chose to deviate from the supposed safe channels, trusting their own instincts, often fared no better in the densely mined areas. The entire coastal region of the home islands had become saturated, leaving no truly viable alternative route for large-scale commerce. The illusion of safety was a deadly operational myth that cost the Japanese thousands of tons of shipping and countless lives. Each sunken vessel in a supposedly safe channel sent a ripple of paralyzing fear through the entire merchant marine and naval command. The Japanese High Command struggled to understand a weapon that was both invisible and selectively lethal, defying their traditional understanding of naval warfare. The mining operation was not a continuous, concentrated attack, but a persistent, low-grade threat that exhausted Japanese resources and broke their will to transport. The psychological warfare of the mines proved just as effective as their explosive force, making the illusion of safety a greater liability than the acknowledged danger. The Imperial Japanese Navy's IJN efforts to counter Operation Starvation were hampered by a confluence of poor intelligence, outdated technology, and limited resources. Their primary minesweeping assets consisted of older trawlers and converted auxiliaries, mostly equipped for the relatively straightforward task of clearing contact mines. They lacked the modern, specialized gear required to effectively deal with the sophisticated magnetic, acoustic, and pressure mines deployed by the B-29s. The typical Japanese magnetic sweep involved dragging a large, heavy coil to induce a magnetic field, a method that was easily thwarted by the American mine sensitivity controls. Acoustic sweeping was often performed by towing noise-making devices, but the American mines were capable of sensing a range of frequencies, making the Japanese efforts hit or miss. The lack of effective pressure mine countermeasures was the biggest failure, as the technology required to counter this threat was beyond Japan's wartime industrial capacity. The IJN was forced to rely on dangerous and unreliable methods, including sending small, fast boats ahead to deliberately trigger the mines. This tactic was costly in both equipment and lives, and it still provided no guarantee that the channel was completely clear for the larger, more valuable vessels to follow. The sheer scale of the American mine-laying, often reseeding the same areas multiple times, overwhelmed the limited Japanese minesweeping fleet. The IJN never achieved the necessary operational tempo to keep the vital straits continuously open, conceding control of the waterways to the B-29s. Fuel shortages further crippled the minesweeping efforts, as precious oil reserves had to be prioritized for the dwindling main battle fleet. The morale of the minesweeping crews was notoriously low, as they knew their work was often futile and that they were operating in some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. Their frustration was compounded by the fact that they were fighting a largely invisible enemy that struck without warning and defied their best efforts to neutralize it. The diversion of naval resources from other critical tasks, such as anti-submarine warfare or fleet escort, further stretched the Japanese defense capabilities. The constant need to clear mines was an economic drain that the already bankrupt Japanese government could ill afford in the final months of the war. Their desperate, last-ditch attempts to develop new countermeasure technologies came too late to make any meaningful difference to the outcome of the campaign. While the primary target of Operation Starvation was Japanese commerce, the Imperial Japanese Navy IJN itself did not escape the devastating toll of the mines. Numerous auxiliary vessels, escort ships, and even some frontline destroyers fell victim to the invisible underwater traps. These were often ships that were either attempting to navigate the supposedly safe channels or were engaged in the futile minesweeping operations. The loss of these smaller, but vital, naval assets severely restricted the IJN's ability to defend its remaining coastline and conduct limited operations. The mines forced the IJN to keep its remaining major warships confined to secure harbors, further limiting their operational relevance in the final phase of the war. Admiralties realized that risking a cruiser or a battleship to a single, cheap, air-dropped mine was an unacceptable exchange rate. The strategic loss was not just the ships themselves, but the precious, experienced manpower that went down with them in the cold waters. These naval casualties exacerbated the IJN's already critical shortage of trained personnel, particularly in specialist fields like mine warfare. The mines were an efficient killer of naval resources, achieving major strategic goals with minimal risk to American forces. The aircrews of the B-29s faced far less resistance when dropping mines than when conducting conventional bombing raids on heavily defended cities. The number of IJN and auxiliary vessels sunk or disabled by mines eventually surpassed the losses inflicted by Japanese submarines or even surface engagements in the area. This statistic is a powerful, silent testament to the efficacy of the air-delivered mine as a definitive weapon of strategic blockade. The mines also served a crucial secondary function by hindering the ability of the IJN to respond effectively to the impending Allied invasion. By keeping the home fleet bottled up and disrupting internal transport, the mines neutralized much of Japan's remaining naval defense. The final resting places of these mine vessels became a grim map of Japan's failed defense, clustered around the key logistical choke points. The destruction of these ships quietly cleared the stage for the unconditional surrender, proving that the silent weapon was sometimes the most effective one. As the war entered its final stages, the mining campaign evolved into a near-perfect economic chokehold on the Japanese Empire. The American strategy moved beyond merely disrupting local traffic to sealing off the entire country from all critical overseas imports. The focus shifted to the major straits that connected Japan to the Asian mainland and the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. By mining these international gateways, the US effectively cut off the last trickle of resources that Japan was desperately trying to smuggle home. Fuel, iron ore, rubber, and food, all essential commodities, were prevented from reaching the Japanese home islands by the submerged mine fences. The finality of the mining campaign left the Japanese industrial machine sputtering and starved of the necessary raw inputs to continue production. Factories that had survived the conventional bombing raids were forced to shut down due to a complete lack of coal or metal. The Japanese war machine, though still capable of fierce resistance, was systematically being drained of its lifeblood by the blockade. This economic collapse had a direct and immediate impact on the Japanese people, leading to severe food shortages and a plummeting national morale. The Japanese government, despite its best efforts at propaganda, could not hide the devastating reality of the empty ports and non-moving freight trains. Operation Starvation achieved what a conventional naval blockade would have struggled to do: total, sustained denial of maritime access. The B-29s, flying above the reach of most Japanese air defenses, could maintain this chokehold with relative impunity and minimal loss. The American High Command viewed the mining campaign as a highly efficient way to soften Japan for the planned invasion, Operation Olympic. In essence, the mines were laying the groundwork for a victory that was to be won by economic exhaustion before the first troop even landed. The success of this final chokehold demonstrated a profound understanding of Japan's geographical and economic vulnerabilities as an island nation. It highlighted how modern naval warfare could be waged not with massive battleship engagements, but with the quiet, persistent pressure of a technologically advanced mine. The war was being won not in spectacular aerial dogfights, but in the dark, silent waters of the Japanese coastal straits. The official end of the war in August 1945 did not mark the end of the deadly legacy left by Operation Starvation. The immense, UN-cleared minefields became an immediate and catastrophic problem for post-war Japanese recovery and Allied occupation forces. Thousands of active American mines, alongside unexploded Japanese ordnance, littered the vital sea lanes, making immediate trade and reconstruction impossible. The harbors and straits had to be painstakingly cleared before food and relief supplies could be safely brought into the starving country. The process of mine clearance was a dangerous, multi-year endeavor that required the cooperation of American and newly reformed Japanese minesweeping forces. This clearance operation, ironically, became one of the most persistent and hazardous military tasks of the immediate post-war era. The pressure mines, in particular, presented a unique challenge, often requiring new, experimental sweeping techniques to neutralize them. Many of the pressure mines were cleared by deliberately sinking old vessels over them to trigger the explosive charge safely. The sheer volume of the mines dropped, estimated to be over 12,000, ensured that the clearance operation was both massive and extremely slow. The dangers were not limited to large vessels. Countless fishing boats and small coastal craft were lost to the remaining fields in the years immediately following the surrender. The lingering threat of the mines continued to impact the Japanese economy, hindering the vital renewal of coastal shipping and fishing industries. Even decades later, occasional, unexploded ordnance from the campaign was discovered, serving as a physical reminder of the war's invisible scars. The massive clearance effort ultimately demonstrated the overwhelming power and longevity of the weapon that had brought Japan to its knees. The final act of the mining campaign was the tedious, painstaking work of undoing the devastation caused by the brilliant, ruthless execution of Operation Starvation. Operation Starvation remains one of the most effective and yet least publicized campaigns of the Second World War in the Pacific theater. It was a strategic masterpiece of economic warfare that avoided the need for a costly, high-casualty direct military invasion of the Japanese home islands. The IJN's early dismissal of the threat proved to be their most costly strategic error, leading to the silent strangulation of their nation. The use of the B-29 as a minelayer represented a revolutionary shift in naval warfare, blurring the lines between air power and sea control. The sophisticated American mines demonstrated the power of non-contact ordnance to paralyze an enemy's logistical network from a distance. The campaign effectively proved that control of an enemy's internal waterways was just as crucial as control of the open ocean. The total tonnage of Japanese shipping sunk by mines eventually rivaled the losses inflicted by the entire U.S. submarine fleet in the final months of the war. Crucially, the mines targeted the economic foundations of the Japanese war effort, ensuring that military resistance could not be sustained. The success of the operation taught the world a valuable, silent lesson about the strategic importance of naval mining in modern conflict. It demonstrated that a cheap, mass-produced weapon could achieve strategic results on par with the most expensive capital ships and bomber fleets. The legacy of Operation Starvation is a testament to the ingenuity of military planners who saw an opportunity to exploit a unique geographic vulnerability. The IJN, having mocked the simplicity of the American mines, was ultimately undone by their technological complexity and the relentless, systematic method of their delivery. The invisible barrier of the minefields quietly guaranteed the surrender, making it truly the weapon that won the Pacific War with the least fanfare. This devastating blockade ensured that by the time the atomic bombs were dropped, Japan was already on the brink of total economic and logistical collapse.